In late 1942, deep in the suffocating jungles of New Guinea, an Australian patrol made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had captured enemy workers, men who had been building airstrips, hauling supplies, and digging fortifications for the Japanese war machine. But when interrogators finally spoke to them, they realized something was terribly wrong. These men weren't Japanese, they were Korean, and they hadn't volunteered. This is the story of the invisible victims of World War II, men stolen from their homeland, forced into slavery, and abandoned in one of the most brutal theaters of war ever fought. This is the story of Korea's forgotten prisoners. To understand how Korean men ended up dying in the jungles of New Guinea, we have to go back 3 decades to 1910. That year, the Empire of Japan formally annexed the Korean peninsula, ending centuries of Korean independence and beginning 35 years of brutal colonial rule. Korea was not treated as a partner, it was treated as a resource. Korean language was suppressed, Korean names were banned, Korean culture was systematically erased. Millions of Koreans were forced into labor, building roads, mining coal, working in factories, all to fuel Japan's growing imperial ambitions. By the late 1930s, Japan was at war with China. By 1941, it was at war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. The Japanese Empire had overextended itself across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Philippines to New Guinea. And it needed workers, millions of them. Soldiers alone couldn't build the airstrips, dig the bunkers, haul the ammunition, and maintain the supply lines that kept this vast empire functioning. So Japan turned to its colonies. In 1942, the Japanese government issued mass mobilization orders across Korea. Young Korean men, some as young as 15, were rounded up under the pretense of voluntary labor, but there was nothing voluntary about it. They were told they were serving the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In reality, they were being shipped to the front lines of Japan's crumbling empire as expendable labor. By 1943, an estimated 5.4 million Koreans had been mobilized for forced labor. Some were sent to factories in Japan, others to mines in Manchuria, and thousands were sent to the jungle hell of New Guinea. New Guinea in 1942 was not just a battlefield, it was a death sentence. The island sits just north of Australia, a massive mountainous landmass covered in some of the most impenetrable jungle on Earth. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity was suffocating, diseases, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, typhus, killed more men than bullets ever did. There were no roads, no infrastructure, just endless jungle, steep mountains, and crocodile-infested swamps. For Japan, New Guinea was critical. If they could hold it, they could threaten Australia, disrupt Allied supply lines, and maintain their defensive perimeter across the Pacific. But holding New Guinea required airfields, supply depots, roads through the jungle, fortifications.
And all of that required labor. Back-breaking, endless labor in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. That's where the Korean laborers came in. They were packed onto transport ships, often the same hellish ships that carried prisoners of war, and sent across the Pacific to places whose names they'd never heard. Rabaul, Leh, Wewak, Hollandia. When they arrived, they found themselves in a nightmare. They weren't soldiers, they had no weapons, no training, no status under military law. They were slave labor, and their job was simple. Work until you dropped, and if you died, someone else would take your place. Life for Korean laborers in New Guinea was a living hell. They worked 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, hacking through jungle with machetes, hauling 100-pound sacks of rice and ammunition on their backs, digging trenches in mud that never dried. They were given minimal food, often just a handful of rice mixed with whatever they could scavenge. Many resorted to eating grass, roots, insects. They had no medical care. Wounds became infected. Malaria ravaged entire work crews. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were left where they fell. The Japanese military treated them as disposable. There are accounts of laborers being beaten for resting, shot for trying to escape, or simply abandoned when supply lines collapsed. One survivor later recalled, "We were not considered human. We were tools. When a tool breaks, you throw it away." And as the war turned against Japan in late 1942 and throughout 1943, conditions grew even worse. Allied forces, primarily American and Australian, began their counteroffensive across the Pacific. They bombed Japanese bases, they cut supply lines, they pushed inland through the same brutal jungles. And the Korean laborers, trapped between two armies, had nowhere to go. When Allied bombs fell, Korean laborers died alongside Japanese soldiers. When supply shipments were sunk at sea, Korean laborers starved. When Japanese forces retreated deeper into the jungle, Korean laborers were ordered to follow or were simply left behind. And then the Australians arrived. By late 1942, Australian forces had taken the lead in the New Guinea campaign. These were tough men, veterans of North Africa, farmers from the outback, volunteers who'd signed up to defend their homeland. They'd been fighting the Japanese across some of the worst terrain imaginable, through the Kokoda Track, across the Owen Stanley Range, in fetid swamps and under relentless tropical rain. They expected fanatical resistance. They'd seen it before. So when an Australian patrol came across a group of Japanese laborers near an abandoned supply camp, they expected a fight, or at minimum, prisoners who would refuse to surrender. Instead, they found men who looked like walking skeletons. Men in ragged clothing, men with no weapons, men who when approached didn't run, they collapsed. The Australians took them prisoner, standard procedure. But during the interrogation, something strange happened. The prisoners didn't speak Japanese, at least not well. When interrogators brought in translators, the prisoners responded in a language none of the Australians recognized: Korean. They weren't Japanese soldiers. They weren't even Japanese civilians. They were Korean men, some barely out of their teens, who had been forcibly conscripted from their homes, shipped across the Pacific, and abandoned in the jungle when the Japanese position collapsed. One Australian officer later wrote in his diary, "We thought we'd captured the enemy. Instead, we'd found victims of the enemy." The Koreans told their stories through broken Japanese and hand gestures, stories of being taken from their villages, of being told they were going to work for the empire, of the hell ships, of the starvation, of watching their friends die from disease, exhaustion, and bombing raids.
Some had been in New Guinea for over a year. Others had arrived just months before. All of them had the same question: can we go home? The Koreans captured in New Guinea were not unique. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, Japan had mobilized millions of people from its occupied territories as forced laborers. Chinese workers, Southeast Asian laborers, Korean men and women. They were forced to build the Burma Railway, the infamous Death Railway, where an estimated 90,000 laborers died. They were sent to coal mines in Japan, where thousands perished in collapsed tunnels and industrial accidents. They were used as laborers on fortified islands across the Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, where they died in the crossfire of some of the war's bloodiest battles. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 1939 and 1945, approximately 670,000 Koreans were sent overseas as forced laborers. Tens of thousands never returned. Many died from disease, starvation, and overwork. Others were killed in Allied bombing raids. Some were executed by Japanese soldiers when bases were overrun, considered a liability or simply abandoned. And when the war ended in August 1945, thousands of Korean laborers were stranded across the Pacific, on remote islands, in prisoner of war camps, or simply lost in the chaos of Japan's collapse. When Allied forces liberated Japanese-held territories, they found Korean laborers everywhere. In the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Burma, in the Pacific Islands, men who had been enslaved, starved, and forgotten. Some were repatriated.
Others, with no documentation, no government to claim them, remained displaced for years. Many never made it home. When the war ended, Korea itself was thrust into a new nightmare. Liberated from Japanese rule, the peninsula was immediately divided, Soviet forces occupying the north, American forces in the south. Within 5 years, Korea would be torn apart by a brutal civil war. For the surviving forced laborers who made it home, there was little recognition, no compensation, no acknowledgement of their suffering. Japan, in the post-war years, focused on its own reconstruction. The issue of forced labor was swept under the rug. South Korea, desperate for Japanese investment during its own rebuilding, signed treaties in 1965 that many survivors felt betrayed their suffering. It wasn't until the 1990s, nearly 50 years after the war, that the stories of Korean forced laborers began to gain international attention. Survivors came forward, historians uncovered documents, activists demanded justice. In 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court ruled that Japanese companies must compensate Korean forced laborers, a decision that sparked a major diplomatic crisis between the two nations. As of today, the issue remains unresolved. That photograph from New Guinea, an Australian soldier with a group of exhausted Korean prisoners, is a rare piece of evidence. It shows a moment when the true victims of empire came face to face with soldiers who had no idea they existed. For decades, these men were invisible, written out of history, forgotten by both the victors and the defeated. But their story is part of the Pacific War, part of World War II, part of the human cost of imperialism and conflict, and it deserves to be remembered.
War is often told through the stories of soldiers, of battles won and lost, of heroism and sacrifice. But for every soldier, there were countless others caught in the machinery of war. Civilians, refugees, prisoners, laborers, people who never wanted to fight, who never chose a side, who were simply trying to survive. The Korean laborers of New Guinea are a reminder that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield. They were victims of colonialism, victims of empire, victims of a conflict that stretched across the entire Pacific and consumed millions of lives. Most of their names are lost to history. Most of their stories will never be told. But in that single photograph, one Australian soldier standing behind a group of exhausted Korean men, we see a glimpse of their reality. We see the forgotten prisoners of World War II. Their suffering should not be forgotten, and their story deserves to be told.